The all-time great StarCraft Brood War player Stork from Korea is someone who I've written about his Brood War career at length in an article entitled Stork's Silver Path of Courage, which I'll link in the description box below if you'd like to read a text version that goes into a lot more detail. But in this video, I'm going to talk about who he was as a player and what he accomplished and his strengths. So, first of all, he is one of the greatest Brood War players of all time. I mean, if you were to put together an all-time list, this guy could arguably be a top 10 player when you consider all of his career accomplishments outside of just titles. Now, unfortunately, one of the things he's famous for is not winning that many titles, but the rest of his career is phenomenal. He truly is, in terms of the body of work, one of the all-time great players. He's probably a top 3 Protoss player of all time in Brood War when you consider who there was out there. Some people might even have him as the best, depending on how they judge that category. He's an OSL champion, the OSL being the most prestigious tournament you could win in Brood War. He won the Inkruit OSL in 2008. Aside from that victory, he was 3 times an OSL runner-up. He was an MSL runner-up, losing in the GOM-TV MSL Season 2 final. And he made the semi-finals or better of either an OSL or an MSL, the two biggest and best StarCraft individual 1v1 leagues. He made the semi-finals or better 8 times over those two competitions. Now, this is what I'm talking about. When you look at the guy's body of work beyond just titles, you see what an all-time great player he is. So to put that in context, okay, yes, people like Flash, Jaedong, Nada, they have an utterly staggering amount of semis or better in those competitions. But this is where Stork stacks up when you talk about other great players. So, okay, Boxer, one of the best players of all time, considered one of the Bonjois, the 4 or 5 Bonjois in history, one of the best players to ever play the game, the original all-time great player back in 2001. Boxer is a 3-time champion, having won 2 OSL, 1 KPGA, which eventually became the MSL. He's only been in 9 semis or better, Stork in 8 or better, 8 semis or better. I Love Uvi, 5-time champion, was only in 8 or more, same as Stork. Savior was a 4-time champion and yet played in less. He was only in 7 semifinals or better. Bisu, the Protoss rival with Stork for the best Protoss of all time, 3-time MSL champion, yet only 7 semifinals or better. Jelizerg, 3-time OSL champion. Remember, Stork only won 1. Jelizerg, 3-time OSL champion, yet only 5 semifinals or better. So you see, beyond the titles, the body of work that Stork put forward was utterly incredible. He just wasn't someone who could close out the deal, and also played a lot of godlike players in those finals. Stork's longevity is also another factor that goes for his greatness. He made the round of 4, the semifinals or better, of an MSL or an OSL every year for 5 straight years. On 17 occasions, he made it to the round of 16 or beyond in the OSL. That's actually a record. No other player in history got that many. He was in 13 consecutive OSL round of 16s. Also, a record. No one accomplishment. No Flash, Jaedong, Nada, Boxer, none of them. He was the only one who could do this. So you see that not only the longevity, but consistency. Even when you got your up and downs, to always be at a certain level. 9 times he was in an OSL quarter-final, round of 8 or better, second most in history. 6 times he was in an OSL semi-final or better, just the OSL, tied with Flash for the most times in history to be in the semi-finals or better of an OSL. Flash, someone who has the most titles in OSL history. That means he has more OSL semi-finals or beyond than Nada, tied for the most titles in history. You can see what a fantastic player this guy was. He was the top-ranked Protoss player in the Kesper ranking for 12 months of his career. He maintained a top 10 Kesper ranking for at least a few months of his career, every year for 7 straight years. He was always top 10 over those 7 years. As in, not every month, but he always managed to be in the top 10 at some point during the 7 years. And he was the number 1 ranked Kesper player for 4 months overall out of his career. And during the era of the Take Bang Lee Sang, which was the great players of his day, which was Bisu, Stork, Flash, Jaedong. These 4 players were the gods of that latter era, 2007 to 2011 or so, was when these guys were the gods, and they were the ones who won most of the titles, made most of the finals. I actually wrote an article on that once, in the shadow of the Take Bang Lee Sang Lang dominance or something like that, which is all about this topic. So in that era, he managed to be the number 1 ranked player for 4 months. Pretty good stuff, right? When you consider those guys are the gods. Flash, Bisu, Jadon, the most incredible players in history. And as a member of that group, he was the guy where, at the end of history, people will look at that group of 4 players and go, well, he's the odd man out, isn't he? He doesn't really deserve to be there because, Bisu, 3 MSL titles. Jadon, 3 OSL titles, 2 MSL titles, so 5 titles in total. Flash, 3 OSL, 3 MSL, 6 titles in total, so 6, 5, 3. Here's Stork with just 1. So people will say, oh, he doesn't deserve to be in that. But the point is, you look at the body of work, I've already showed you some areas where he exceeds some of those players, not winning titles, obviously. And so to have done it in that era, incredible. But I also think you could compare that era of players to the big 4 of tennis over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, which is obviously Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, and Andy Murray. Because on that group, people say the same thing about Andy Murray. They go, oh, well, he's only won a couple of Grand Slams. The others have all won many, like more than 8 each. Shouldn't be in their group. But the point is, once you get past the titles, you look at how many finals, how many semi-finals, how many smaller titles. He's closer to their group than he is to the players behind, which is the same with Stork and the other players of the era. So I'd compare him to Murray in this particular scenario. Least titles and also many second places, mainly losing to those players as well, which is what denied him the places that in another era might have meant he was an even better player. He was also one of the 6 dragons of Protoss, this incredible group of Protoss that rose up around late 2008 to the first part of 2009 and actually dominated the game and reversed a lot of the famous trends, such as making PvZ imbalanced for Protoss. He was a World Cyber Games champion, this essentially Olympics of gaming held once every year, and Korea had a long heritage of winning it, and he won it one year. He won it in 2007. As well as winning it, he was a 2-time runner-up, 2-time silver medalist at the World Cyber Games. So you can see, yes, he didn't win that many titles, but he was a fantastic player over the breadth of his career. Also, a very good team league player, pro league player, over the span of his career. Not quite as fantastic at times as people like Bisu or Flash or Jadong during their best periods in pro league, but the tenure over the pro league, very good, and early on a very good pro league player. So we're going to talk now about some of his career, and I'm going to go year by year. So 2005 was the year he really became introduced into the top level of Korean StarCraft in terms of playing in the tournaments, playing in pro league. And at the time, he was only a 16-year-old guy. Western age. He started to make his appearance in OSLs. He made 3 OSL round of 16s that year. He broke into the top 30 of the Kesper ranking, which was based, by the way, not just on placing in tournaments, but on who you beat, because it was an ELO system. Well, it wasn't entirely an ELO system, but it was kind of based on that. Depending on matches won, it earned you points to get higher in the Kesper ranking. So ranked top 30 by Kesper that year. He was part of what, at the time, this is something a lot of people have forgotten, was called the 3 Neo Kings of Protoss that year, which was Anytime, who obviously was a guy who would go on to play and win OSL. It was Pusan, who made a couple of OSL semi-finals, and Stork was the 3rd guy. And the reason they were called the 3 Neo Kings of Protoss is because at this point in time, they were replacing the 3 Kings of Protoss, which was Reach, OSL champion, Kingdom, also an OSL champion, and or maybe that was the MSL. I think it was the OSL. And Nalra, MSL champion. Yeah. So he was replacing that era, and so you can see even though he hadn't won anything yet, he hadn't done anything massive yet, just as a young up-and-coming talent, he was already being seen by the community and recognized that this is one of the Protoss talents to lead the next generation. And part of that was he was a strong macro Protoss. He came in with this style where a unit that wasn't used very much at the time, the Arbiter, he was using this style in PvT, and he was a late game specialist. One of the strengths of Stork's whole career was being good at managing his macro. He was never a phenomenal APM player or amazing multitasking, but just knowing smart decision making on how to play macro, he was always very good at, and he was always a very good PvT player. That was always his strength, and this Arbiter style at that time was crucial for him. Samsung Khan were able to win the Kesper Cup, one of the smaller team league tournaments. They finished 2nd in Pro League in the guy's first career, and he got 10 kills along the way, so he had a particularly good series. And in the playoffs, he managed to win games against Savior, against Gorosh, 2 of the best Zergs of that era, even though PvT was his best matchup. And for 2005, he actually won Rookie of the Year at the Kesper Awards. 2006, this is where he kind of just held rank to some degree. He didn't really get beyond his level of 2005, and you wondered at this point what he would accomplish, because in the Kesper ranking, he managed to finally crack top 10 early on in the year. But that was mainly because of Pro League wins, etc. He hadn't had that much individual league success yet. He makes it to more round of 16s of some Pro League MSL, but Nothing going there, but Pro League success continuing to go. He gets ranked as high as 7th in Kesper in May. Unfortunately, in the next MSL and OSL, towards the end of the year, he falls out in the prelims. He doesn't actually qualify. And so in December, his ranking drops to match that. The ranking in Kesper was a bit like the ranking in tennis, in the PGA, obviously it's not that, in the Tennis Association, whatever that's called, where you kind of hold on to your points in it, and once your results happen, there's a little bit of lag before it's going to be calculated in. So by the end of the year, because of his poor performance in the individual leagues, he's dropped down to 30th. So you're thinking, is he ever going to make it as a great player? 2007 is the year where he answers that question and has his best year in many ways. So 2007, the guy comes in and he's able to make dual semi-finals of the OSL and MSL, which often ran at the same sort of time, but they were set up so you could play in both if you went far. Now, he made the semis of both. In the Daum OSL, he made the semi-finals, lost to Iris, the Terran player, actually in a sweep by Iris. But then in the third place decider, he played Flash, and this was actually the first OSL Flash had qualified for. It was like some 14-year-old kid and shocked everyone. And Stork takes this guy to school. He wrecks him 3-0 in the third place decider. Over in the MSL, amazingly, Stork had actually been eliminated earlier in the tournament by Xavier. His worst matchup was always PVZ. He lost to Xavier 0-2. Xavier had been a finalist for the last 5 MSL finals. But because Oversky had gone off to the army and had gone to play in the Air Force, there was a wildcard tournament held for the last spot. Stork won it. Stork got back into the tournament, and he made it all the way to the final. In the final, he played Bisu, who was the champion of the previous season, and a Protoss player, and they had this amazing PvP final, one of the best PvP series ever played in Brood War history. Ended up being won by Bisu in the 5th game, 3-2, in part, because Stork forgot to upgrade Dragoon range, and that was part of the deciding factor. Bisu wins the title. Stork gets his first silver in a big tournament. But second and third place in these 2 dual tournaments, running side by side, pretty good result, and shows that he's arrived as an individual player. Then we go into Pro League. In Pro League, his team was able to win round 1. He won the deciding final map versus Anytime from Oz, and he went 16 out of 20 in maps 1, 80% record. He had a 6-win streak to end the season. He won the MVP of Pro League. He won the finals MVP of Pro League. So he's announced himself as an individual player, coming close to winning both leagues. And now in Pro League, he's the best player. So you can see Stork has arrived. This is when he's going to have fantastic success. Unfortunately, this is when the other gods of Brood War have arrived. Bisu's just arrived, Flash has started to arrive, and Jaedong's coming towards the end of the year. So you can see he could have had an unreal amount of success in 2007, but in terms of titles, you can see how it's going to unfold as we go on. So at the World Cyber Games qualifier for Korea, which is because Korea was the best country, it was always a very competitive tournament itself. He finished 2nd place to Hwasun there, but that means he qualified along with the top 3 players from that tournament always qualify for World Cyber Games. So he goes to the World Cyber Games. On the 1st of October, he is ranked number 1 Kesper player in the world for these successes. WCG, the 2 individual leagues, the Pro League. At the time, Bisu wasn't known as a great Pro League player. So even though Bisu had won 2 SMLs in a row, that didn't get him the Kesper ranking at this point in time because his Kesper ranking was lost, and now Stork took it with more accomplishments. He goes to the World Cyber Games finals, and Xavier gets shocked out earlier in the tournament. Hwasun, he beats in the round of 8. He makes it to the final. He plays the Chinese player PJ. He beats him. He wins the gold medal. So you can see already the year's already become something special, and it's not going to stop there. In the MSL, he only made it to the round of 16 because he had to face Xavier again, and this time Xavier beat him again, but 2-1 this time. Always PVZ was the trouble matchup for Stork. In the same competition on the other side, though, the OSL running at the same time, the EVA 2007 OSL, this is where things get special again for Stork, because he manages to go on this sick run where he makes it to the final. And in the final, he... actually, let me just double check something. I just need to double check something. I don't want to get this wrong, but I think I might have forgotten to add something when I was thinking about that final. Yeah, so the part of what made his run to the final so incredible was that in the round of 8, he played Flash, who's already showing himself to be a very talented player, but hasn't broken through as like a god yet. He beats Flash 2-1. In the semi-finals, he plays Bisu. Bisu's won 2 MSLs in a row. People are saying this is Bisu's time. This time he beats Bisu 3-0. Clean sweep, wrecks him. Now he goes into the final. He's got rid of Flash, he's got rid of Bisu. Now he has to play Jaedong. Now at this point in time, Jaedong is not a god. Jaedong's never won any massive competitions. And in fact, Stork comes in as the favourite because of what an incredible year he's been having. And people think this is his time to win. At that point in time, he'd actually already played Jaedong in the group stage of the same tournament. And he'd beaten him on the map there. He had played Jaedong in the IEF, which was a smaller competition. And he had lost in the final there to Jaedong, but that had been close, like a 2-1. And as a result, a lot of people thought to themselves, this is Stork's time. He's going to win this. So, coming into the final, Stork had a 64% win rate against Zerg for the year. He'd won 29 games, lost 16. He actually was at a 4-2 record in games played against Jaedong. And Jaedong was a Royal Roader, which meant it was Jaedong's first ever OSL, and the guy made it all the way to the final. And if he wins, he's going to walk the Royal Road and be a Royal Roader properly. Jaedong was a Royal Roader candidate. So this is Jaedong's first ever OSL individual tournament. Jaedong's versus Protoss at the time, even though later he'd become the god of ZVP, at the time wasn't that godlike actually. It was worse than Stork's PVZ. He had a 63% win rate. And over his lifetime, and for 2007 actually, only 57% win rate. So actually, the matchups favoured Stork to win this matchup as well. One of the maps that he'd beaten Jaedong on in that tournament, in the group stage, was called Persona, which was going to be one of the maps in the final. But what happens is, after Stork wins, I think it was the first game, Jaedong reverse sweeps and wins 3-1. I mean, I guess not a full reserve sweep. And the key moment that happens is this EE hand timing moment, where Jaedong, if he waits a little bit longer, Stork's going to have enough Corsairs to be able to beat him and have superiority. Jaedong does this crazy Mutalisk attack. He pulls it off. He beats him. Jaedong obviously wins that tournament, goes on to become one of the greatest players of all time, wins many more tournaments. But at the time, this is a shocking upset. Like, oh, what? This guy's not, his best matchup isn't even ZVP. He's beaten Stork, like probably maybe the best player in the world at this point in time. You're thinking that was Stork's chance to be the champion. As a result, afterwards, Bisu takes back the #1 ranking. Stork slips down to second. In the MSL, Stork fails in the prelims. So the year ends, and despite not winning any major titles aside from WCG, Stork's had a fantastic year. Against all players over the whole year, he had more than 100 wins, and he got a 70% win rate. In Pro League, he'd managed 30 wins to only 9 losses. He'd come Silver OSL, the last one. Silver MSL, the second one. Bronze OSL, the first one. Gold WCG, first place in Pro League, and the MVP, and the Finals MVP, and the Best Protoss Kesper Award. So a fantastic year. Unfortunately, a little short on titles for how often he was essentially there nearly all the time to potentially win. But you've seen he's arrived. He's been the #1 ranked player. He's going to be a force. 2008 comes along. Now, in 2008, he continues to be a very strong Pro League player. He goes 15-6 in Pro League Round 1, 71% win rate. He has a 9-game winning streak during that. He's ranked #1 in January in Kesper again, takes the spot back from Bisu. Pro League Grand Finals in February. He loses to any time in the final there. His team finishes second, but he's still a Pro League beast. Then the GOM tournaments come along. Not to be confused with the GOM MSLs, where GOM sponsored MSL. These were GOM tournaments where they ran their own separate tournaments as like a third big league, along with the OSL and along with the MSL. Now, in the first one of these was actually the Invitational, and Stork got to the final there, and he played against Flash, the same guy he'd beaten out in the third place decider of that OSL, the Daum, and the same guy he'd thrashed in the he'd beaten him 2-1 in the Ever OSL, the one that he'd made to the final of when Jaedong had been there. So he plays him in the final now, and Stork pioneers this incredible build. Oh, no, let me think what it was. Let me think. Stork at the time was like a monster using carriers. It was very hard to stop. And Flash had only barely been able to stop his carriers with this special build he'd come up with. And he only wins the final 3-2, incredibly close fashion. And so it just so happens at the same time the OSL is running. And over in the OSL, what do you know? Flash and Stork make the final of that. And so since it's only 2 weeks after the Invitational, In his pre-game trash talk, Flash starts saying, like, I'm going to use this anti-carrier build again. I'm going to destroy you with it. So Stork's getting mind-gamed. Like, is he going to do that? Am I going to have to do that? And they even practiced against each other in this time period beforehand. Now, the reason why this is significant is because, again, Flash has never won a massive tournament at this point in time, except this tournament. Because what happens now is they come in, and earlier in the tournament, same story. He'd played against Flash earlier in the OSL. He'd played him on Blue Storm, and this is actually a map that he'd beaten Flash on, just like he'd beaten J-Dog on Persona. Flash came in with only a 60% lifetime win rate versus Protoss, only 66% the previous year, so not some god versus Protoss. And the whole anti-carrier thing was the ambience surrounding it. Unfortunately, Flash wrecks the final to the extent that the games only take a maximum of 15 minutes total for all 3 games to be played. The fastest OSL final in history, and Flash wins 3-0 in a sweep, wrecking Stork completely, partly thanks to the mind games. So you can see, Stork's now getting a reputation. He's the guy who finishes second. He's the guy who always loses when it's the big time. And he's making people like Flash and J-Dog further along the path towards becoming legends. As we know, they would become much, much greater players, and now we can look back in hindsight and see that it makes sense that they beat Stork at these points in time, even though he came in as favourites for some of these tournaments. In fact, a number of Team Liquid writers at the time were predicting Stork to win both of these finals. So he's lost 2 finals in quick succession, but you can still tell he's one of the elite players in the world. In the next GOM season, he managed to make the round of 8, but he lost to a player called Bako there, another Protoss player. In the EVA OSL, he only managed to make it to the round of 16, but still pretty good. He goes to BlizzCon for what at the time was not called BlizzCon, it was called the Worldwide Invitational. And this was a tournament that was mainly Stork and then like other players who were okay, like C was a Team League player, or like old school players like Yellow and Nada, who were like great players once upon a time, but are long since past. He played at this tournament and he won it because he was by far the best player there. In Pro League, his team manages to win Pro League. They play Sparkies in the final, a team that's now actually, well, since was disbanded for having too many cheaters in it, actually. He beat Luxury in the second map of the final, helped them win the final. He had a 60% win rate over this Pro League run. He's still one of the best players. He has more team success to go with his individual success. WCG Korea qualifier comes along again. Finishes second yet again, even in the Korea qualifiers. Loses to J-Dong in the final this time, the guy who'd beaten him in the EVA 2007 OSL final towards the end of the year. The Incruit OSL comes along, and it's in the latter part of 2008. And in the round of 8, he plays Bisu, the guy who he thrashed in that OSL, the guy who'd beaten him in the MSL final. He beats him 2-1 in a great PvP series. In the semi-finals, he plays Best, OSL champion, one of the best Protoss, but he beats him in PvP, beats him 3-1 in the semi-finals. He gets to the final of the Incruit OSL. Here in the final, he's playing Fantasy. And Fantasy himself is a Royal Road candidate, but like J-Dong was the year before. Fantasy is this brilliant tactical player. Maybe not the best player in terms of all styles of play, but he's got this great style of play that he has pioneered, this harassment style, and he's got the coach, I Love Uv, one of the all-time great winners, 5-time champion, to coach him and help him come up with builds. And more importantly, in the previous OSL was the one where, let me think, was it actually the previous one? I'll check this again. There's no point getting the shit wrong, is there? Right, let's have a look. No, it was the next one actually I'm thinking of. Okay, no, anyway. In the OSL final, in came Fantasy. Fantasy had a lifetime Protoss win rate of 63%, and for 2008 also 63%. So good, pretty good. That's actually very good actually. But we know Stork's a PvT specialist. Stork has a 64% win rate, lifetime versus Terran, 62% for that year, but he's one of the best players in the world. And more importantly, at the time, Fantasy is a rookie, like I say. He's a young player. This final, also 3-2, like that one that he had in the MSL against Bisu, but this time, Stork prevails. He wins in the last game. He manages to take the title for himself. He's finally an OSL champion. Admittedly, not against a god like those other guys, but against a young player again who might become on the road to becoming a god, like the storyline of J-Dog and Flash, etc. He manages to finally become an OSL champion, the most prestigious title you can win. And what's funny is, when he wins, because of all the heartbreak he's had, he even says like how awkward it is and how he didn't even know what to do when he won the final. And he actually even said that the losses from J-Dog and Flash had really helped him, because obviously they'd forced him to try and get better. And actually, interestingly, here's a great quote I have for you. He said that the biggest inspiration, though, had come the before when he'd seen the previous OSL, where he'd seen July win over Best in the final. And he said, when I saw July win, I was so jealous. How can someone make his opponents tremble in fear like that? How can someone who isn't at his prime like he used to be so good at mind games? I had to learn because Flash and Jaedong taught me mind games is what win leagues, not how perfect your plays are. Now, that's a very telling statement because, first of all, Stork wasn't a player who really put fear into his opponent's minds in the finals. In fact, he often crumbled. And what he'd noticed here was, think about how many times he's winning semis and round of eights over these guys and making it to finals. He realizes it's not just skill that's deciding these. It's not just the plays that's deciding it. Part of it's nerve, composure, how you fuck with your opponent to make him do the wrong thing. So he's finally realized by winning, this is part of what it's about because he's done that himself to a rookie. In the MSL, which was one that all the Protoss made it super far in because we're going into the era when Protoss dominates briefly. He only makes it to the semi-quarterfinals because he loses there to Cal in PvP, a very good shuttle specialist. He loses a 3-2 series there, otherwise he might have gone further. In the second season of GOM Classic, he again loses in the round of 16. Well, it was a different tournament. I think it was the MSL. He'd lost in the round of 16 before. Tobacco, another person who'd beaten him. He goes to the World Cyber Games. In the World Cyber Games, he plays Jaedong in the quarterfinals, beats Jaedong. You see, he could beat Jaedong. It's just that he couldn't, unfortunately, when it came to the big pressure finals, whereas Jaedong was a very clutch player in finals. He makes it to the final. He's got a chance to go back-to-back as WCG champion. But he's playing as Luxury, again, a Zerg player, one of his worst matchups. And Luxury, obviously, is someone who went on to win the MSL. So he was actually one of the best Zergs of the time. Unfortunately, he was banned for match fixing a couple of years later, so people have kind of forgotten him and erased him from history. Stork, unfortunately, loses 0-2 and has to win the silver medal at the World Cyber Games. He goes to IEF, which again was a tournament that was like a smaller tournament with a number of top Koreans in. He loses to Bisu in the final here, another rival of his for Protoss. And at the end of the year, though, because of this fantastic success still, even though he's not winning, he manages to get ranked number 1 by Kesper again and overtakes Flash this time. This is the era of the Six Dragons. The Six Dragons were Bisu, Stork, Jangbi, Best, Cal, and Free. And they dominated the last quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009 in terms of overall success and accomplishments and titles and second places and top fours, etc. And he was the first of these people to meet, when they became the Six Dragons, to reach number 1 in the Kesper rankings when they were kind of dominating this particular time. And he'd actually kind of spurred on that success by being the one to rise to the top, because actually BC had been slumping during the earlier part of 2008. He had an overall, from July of 2008 till the OSL final of November 2008, he had a win rate of 37 wins to only 16 losses. So you can see what an incredibly high-level player this guy was. Over that period of time, he got his win rates like this. Versus Protoss, 61% win rate. Versus Zerg, 61% win rate. Versus Terran, his best matchup, 85% win rate. And overall, 69% win rate. Over the year, he had an OSL gold medal. He had a GOM silver medal. He had a WCG silver medal. He won Pro League Round 1. Had very good Kesper rankings throughout the whole year. So still an elite level player. But you can see, after 2 years of extremely high level play and lots of deep finishes, he's only got one big title in terms of the OSL to count for it, and a World Cyber Games the year before. So he's had a lot of chances that have gone past him. 2009 is a year that's not going to be as kind to Stork. So the year starts out, still the Six Dragons era. He manages to make it to the semi-finals of the Lost Saga MSL. He plays Jangbi, his teammate, fellow Protoss player. Unfortunately, he gets rinsed out 3-0 there. Same season over in the OSL, he makes it to the round of 8 there. So he's made it to the round of 8 or better of both tournaments that year, again showing his consistent individual form. He plays Jaedong here in the round of 8, and this time he loses to Jaedong. It's 2-1, even though he won the first game. Jaedong goes on to win that OSL. So we can see again another what might have been. In the GOM Classic, which is next up, he actually loses very early on in a shocking upset to, at the time, a complete unknown called MVP, who, as it happens, is the greatest StarCraft 2 player of all time. But at the time, was a nobody. And obviously, PvT, Stork specialist matchup. He loses 1-2 to MVP in the round of 64 there. In the next OSL, he makes the round of 16, but no further. In the Pro League, unfortunately, he loses in the Super Ace match to Effort from CJ. And despite having a fantastic individual season in Pro League, his team doesn't win Pro League. He went 26-16 in wins to losses, which is a 63% win rate. He had a 6-win streak again. So again, very good individual player, still a fantastic team league player. You can see it's like 2.5 years now the guy's been carrying this on. WCG Korea qualifier comes along. Again, he qualifies by finishing top 3, but again, he comes second. This time losing out to another player. He loses out to Bisu in the final, one of his classics, even though in the semis he'd beaten Jaedong. So you can see he always is like losing and beating Jaedong and Bisu at the wrong times in history. Despite the fact he can play and beat all these players, Jaedong, Bisu, Flash, he can beat them all, and he does. He just doesn't at the right times in history. But he's qualified for World Cyber Games. In the OSL, towards the end of the year, the Ever OSL, the one that Flash goes on to win early in the next year, he beats Flash in the round of 16, the eventual champion. He makes it to the quarterfinals. He's playing this guy called Shine there, this cheesy Zerg who everyone hates for cheesing out Bisu earlier on and kicking him out of the OSL. Shine manages to beat him 2-1. So he goes out in the quarterfinals. IEF, again, he's playing in this. This time he wins it, but with a little bit of help. Bisu and Effort were there, two of the best players of the year, one of the best Protoss player, one of them, and one of the better Zergs. Unfortunately, both of those got mega upset in super shocking fashion in the group stage. So actually, in the rest of the tournament, it's a cakewalk for Stork. In fact, funnily enough, in the semi-finals, he plays Idra, later on, at the time, one of the better foreigners, and later on, one of the best foreigners in StarCraft 2, beats him easily in the semi-finals, wins the IEF finally. Not a massive title, though. World Cyber Games comes up towards the end of the year, November, and he gets to the final, as he'd done 2 previous years, and he loses again, this time to Jaedong, but again, PVZ. Jaedong's the best Zerg at the time, and Jaedong is a god versus Protoss, so that's also what's hard. But he still wins a game, but he loses 2-1, has to get his second WCG silver medal, but his third WCG medal overall. In the MSL, he went out in the round of 32, not a very good placing, and so he finishes the year overall ranked 10th, still pretty good. Over the year, he had an MSL semi-final appearance, he had 2 OSL quarterfinals appearance, and a WCG silver medal. So still decent, still a top player in Pro League, but he's dropped off individually. He's not contending to really win these titles to the same degree anymore. 2010 comes along, and 2010 is a very disparate year, a very down year for Stork. It's one of the worst years of his career. In the OSL, he only makes it to the group stage, the round of 16, then he goes out. Over in the MSL, he makes it to the round of 32. Funnily enough, in the round of 32, he loses the MVP again, still a fucking nobody. In the next MSL, he falls out in the prelims, does nothing. In Pro League, he keeps it rolling in Pro League at least. He manages to get 24 wins to 14 losses, 63% win rate, still a top player there. Not a god though, because at this point in time, Flash is in absolute god mode. Jaedong's still in fantastic form. Bisu starts to come back into form. He does have a match though, where he manages to win an ace match against Jaedong when he plays Oz in week 4 of the Pro League, wins 3 matches there. In fact, that was Winners League, so he won 3 games in a row and won the match for them. That was a pretty big game. He has one really nice run, which is in the Korean Air OSL Season 2. He makes it to the semi-finals. And this is where Jaedong and Flash have been in the last 2 MSL finals in a row. So can Stork beat Jaedong to make it to the final? Unfortunately, he loses to Jaedong in a full 5-game series, and it's like a classic mistake costs him, because he doesn't build a cannon at the right time in the series, and that really costs him a key game against Jaedong, who looked like he was going to be out. It looked like Stork could do it, looked like he was going to win this series. Doesn't matter, Jaedong's so clutch, Jaedong always does it, and Jaedong was in fantastic form, even though he was always losing to Flash in these finals now. So unfortunately, he only makes it to the semis there. IEF comes around yet again, and yet again he loses to Bisu in a final there. He ends the year on an 11th ranking in Kesper, so still pretty good, but for the year, ultimately, only one OSL semi-final to show for it, but a good Pro League performance. 2011 comes along. He has a return to individual league form. In the OSL and MSL, he makes good runs in both. He makes it to the round of 8, the quarterfinals of both. In the PD Pop MSL, he beats Bisu in the round of 16. And at the time, the tournament was full of Zerg, so everyone was like, oh, if Bisu makes it through, he's going to have a chance to make the final, maybe play Jaedong or something. He beats Bisu, knocks him out in the round of 16, comes into the quarterfinals, he has to play Zero, who at the time is one of the best Zergs. Zero actually ends up going to the final. He gets swept by Zero, 3-0. So he's out of the MSL. Over in the OSL, he manages to make it to the final. And in the final, He's playing Fantasy, and it's a rematch of the Incruit OSL final where he'd beaten Fantasy 3-2. Now, all the factors suggest that Stork's going to win this because Stork's in great individual form. Fantasy's kind of returning back to individual league form after a long time of not being in the one. Stork's become the first Protoss player in history to reach 4 OSL finals. He's 23 years old, so even though he's quite an old player for a great Brood War player, he's still in good form. Unfortunately, there's a couple of factors that are ominous and make you start to wonder what might happen. So Stork's girlfriend breaks up with him like a week before the final. Yeah, lovely person, right? So that's probably putting stress on his mind. And it was held in Gwangju, which was the site of the shortest OSL final in history. Do you remember that? That was the one where it was the Bacchus 2008 final that Flash had thrashed him in. So a little bit ominous, but hey, you don't believe in superstition, right? Unfortunately, Fantasy comes prepared. Fantasy has this very clever approach where he's like elevating units up, and he has these great builds, and he actually sweeps Stork in the final, smashes him 3-0, and Fantasy wins his first OSL. And Stork's been denied a third time in the OSL finals. This good run of form in the individual leagues, though, puts Stork 4th in Kesper. So he's managed to get right back up into the top 5 again, even though it's now 2011. He's been playing for years and years at this point in time. In the next MSL, he makes it to the round of 16, but loses there, unfortunately, to Hydra, who goes on to win the tournament, actually. Is that the one he won? No, Hydra had won the last tournament. I got that wrong. In Pro League, he continues to be a good player, but he's dropped off a little bit now. He gets 24 wins, and he has a 55% win rate. Now, in Week 4, Winners League, he'd had this really crazy run of form, though. In Winners League, he'd gone 13-3, 81% win rate. He's looking super sick. Overall in Winners League, all the weeks, he'd gone 65% win rates. He thought maybe he's coming back, but he cooled off a little bit. In the OSL, Jin Air OSL, he made it to the round of 16 again, as he's been doing all the time, but he goes out there. IEF, he comes to yet again, and he plays Bisu in the final, and can you guess what's going to happen? Yes, you're right. He loses to Bisu in a very narrow 3-2 series. His rival again beats him in the key moment in time, and he ends the year on a Kesper ranking of 8th. So still a solid one, but overall for the year, his best performance to show for is really the silver medal in the OSL. 2012 was the last year of Brood War, and in this particular time, we had one OSL, the rest of the competitions were gone, MSL was dead, and then Pro League switched over to this hybrid Pro League format. So in the OSL, nothing happening for Stork. It's over individually. But in the Pro League, in the first season, he goes 71% win rate. He's back as a team league player. He manages to get all the way to play KT Rolster. Unfortunately, he loses as the playoff ace in the first series against Stats, another Protoss player, who actually at the time was in very good form, even though he wasn't a great individual league player. In June of this year, 2012, the last year of Brood War, Stork gets to his highest Kesper ranking in quite a long time. He's tied for 3rd. In StarCraft 2 is now being introduced. And what happens is MLG holds this Kesper Invitational Exhibition Tournament at an MLG tournament. I think it was spring or summer finals in probably Dallas, I'd have to guess, or Anaheim, one of the two. And they just fly over 8 Kesper pros like J-Dong, Flash, etc. And Stork plays there, and he just loses outright to Flash. But a funny note, Flash's pro keyboard actually breaks during the match, but Flash still wins that game anyway. In the hybrid Brood War StarCraft 2 Pro League, where if you played a Brood War game, then in your next match, later on in the other segment, you had to play your next game in Pro League in a StarCraft 2 segment, or it could be in another game later on. So in Brood War, Stork does well. He wins 5 of his 8 games, 62% win rate. In StarCraft 2, he does particularly well. He wins 8 of his 11 games. His one loss his losses actually in StarCraft 2, one was to Sun, as he was called at the time, later known as Rain, one of the great Protoss players in StarCraft 2 later, and 2 of them came to Zero, the guy who'd actually eliminated him from the MSL a year before. That was actually in Brood War, I'm thinking of, my mistake, because that was Rain started to come on strong towards the end of Brood War. And in the final, his team actually made the final of that tournament against CJ, and unfortunately he lost to Hero in his match there, as in the one who went on to be the great hero of StarCraft 2, not the Team Liquid one, the one who won all the IEMs, in the final. At the end of Brood War, September ranking for Kesper, He's ranked 7th at the end of Brood War. And you can see, again, he's managed to get his rating back up there. Fantastic player. Now, over his career, his rivals. Well, he was obviously rivals with all the great players of his era. Flash, Jaedong, Bisu. Flash, he met him a number of times, a couple of finals. He beat him a bunch of times in like quarterfinals, in Pro League. Bisu, but obviously not in the 2 big finals that mattered. Bisu was a guy where, even though he lost to him in that MSL final, he beat him in a number of key matchups in OSLs and MSLs in terms of, well, mainly OSLs, in terms of like round of 8s and semi-finals and stuff to stop Bisu ever winning an OSL or ever making an OSL final. But IEF finals, he was always losing to Bisu. So overall, very backwards and forwards matchup. Jaedong is obviously someone where he lost to him in the final of the OSL. But there were other times where he was able to beat Jaedong, where he was able to. And in Pro League, he was able to win ace matches over him, but always lost to him at the key moments. The other 2 people I'd list as real rivals of Stork throughout his career would obviously be Fantasy, because they met in 2 OSL finals. They had a bunch of matches against each other, just in terms of they went 1-1. That was very interesting. And Jangbi, just because, even though he didn't play Jangbi tons, played him in a couple of instances, it's that Jangbi was the other Protoss in Samsung. So even though Stork was a fantastic Team League player, there were times when Jangbi was considered the better player, and actually at the end of Brood War, Jangbi won the last 2 OSLs going out of the door. So Jangbi ended up with more OSL titles and more major titles than Stork actually, even though Jangbi is not an all-time great player to the level of Stork. He is an all-time great player, but not as great as Stork when you look at the body of their work. So in StarCraft 2, Stork's been playing the whole time from 2012 onwards. He was Challenger in a couple of seasons early on, Challenger/Code A. In Pro League, he had a week. It was week 3 of the 2014 Pro League, where he managed to be the MVP of the league, actually, by the voting. He attended a couple of foreign tournaments in 2014, Home Story Cup 9, IEM Season 9 Shenzhen. Didn't make particularly much impact on these tournaments. He becomes the player coach of Samsung in November of 2014. Often had long been the captain, fantastic player. He's made the player coach. Despite this, he actually managed to qualify for Code S 3 times in 2014 and 2015 combined, but never made it past the round of 32 group, always lost there. And actually, as of the time of this video, has qualified for the latest Code S season in 2016. So we can see, remember, this guy came into the top level of Korean Brood War in 2005, and in 2016, 11 years later, he's in Code S round of 32 again. So this guy is just an incredible longevity and consistency and ability to find ways to win with his brain, even when his skills aren't as good as some of the other people. He's a guy where I think he's just one of the most admirable players of all time. He wasn't always my favourite to watch. He wasn't always the most skilled, the most flashy, the most wowing. He obviously wasn't so clutch in finals. He was fantastic in semis and quarters, though. But he is an all-time great player. You can't deny his body of work. He was a very special player. And he was someone where his strength was macro. His strength was decision-making, planning for people, making builds. He made a lot of builds that Bisu just stole from him and then out executed using his fantastic mechanics. He was someone, though, where he found a way to be a champion all the time. Or found a way to be a very good player, at least. I guess championship level would be a better way to say, because he obviously wasn't a champion that many times. But he constantly returned to that level, and his longevity is in many ways unparalleled by anyone even from his era. So you have to respect him. Now, obviously, most of my videos all have an alpha draft plug. You can't play any sort of StarCraft 2 on alpha draft, but if you want to play Dota 2, perhaps, or Smite, or League of Legends, or CSGO, go to alphadraft.com.